First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Good morning. My name is Paul Nelson, and I'm a member of this congregation with all of you. And my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a former ELCA Lutheran minister who served several Lutheran congregations throughout eastern and central Iowa. I can also say that I taught in 2 community colleges and taught world religions and the philosophy of ethics there in Muscatine and Boone. And I was profoundly educated at both of those locations, both in congregations and in the community college, about fear, about specifically how fear and religious harm can frequently raise their ugly heads in ways that I might never have anticipated. As you've heard, our theme this month is fear. That's why I thought it appropriate to address the issue of religion's harm. As someone who seeks to follow Jesus of Nazareth as my spiritual path, I find it particularly important for me to address this issue, which has in our Western history, let's be honest, bedeviled Christians and Christianity. By the way, as a brief aside, I hope you noticed that I said Jesus of Nazareth and not Jesus Christ. And that's because my spirituality dictates that I need to set that aside, including the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creeds, which many of you probably learned as a child. And thanks to the efforts of many modern Roman Catholic and Protestant biblical and theological scholars, as was mentioned before, the Jesus Seminar, my spiritual approach would also set aside a lot of the doctrinal and dogmatic affirmations that people fight about or have in the past, such as the virgin birth of Jesus, the benefits of his blood sacrifice from the cross, and the supposedly miraculous setting aside of natural law in Jesus' many healings as narrated in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I don't think I really need to lay out what awful stuff Christians have done throughout at least Western history, but let me name just a few. The early and significant anti-Jewish teaching that got baked into Christianity early on. I can't tell you how many Good Friday prayers that I've led at Lutheran congregations in which I've had to improvise on the spot because of their awful anti-Jewish implications of some of the prayers. And this reality from a Lutheran book of worship that was produced and used in Lutheran congregations at least since the late 70s and on through the 1990s. Next, while the early Jesus movement in Palestine was praiseworthy for its inclusion of women in its leadership, and I don't think that story is told often enough, hopefully you can call to mind, if you remember, all of those Greek names that you come across when you read some of Paul's epistles or Paul's writings that he mentions in them. Most of those names are Greek women. We don't really know because we don't know as Western Americans so much about Greek names, but many of those names are women. And he's quoting them as leaders in some of the early communities. Sadly, it has to be said that those early and noble efforts of Jesus' movement to include women and other marginalized people in the movement were cast aside by the Roman emperor's imperial designs, specifically thanks to Emperor Constantine at a bishop's convocation in Nicaea, from which we have the Nicene Creed. The church at that point strictly decided to codify what theologies were acceptable in churches and what was orthodox, of course. And those people and movements who sought to preserve alternate views about Jesus were cast aside. And they were often increasingly marked with the tag of heresy, which often meant not just exclusion, but death. The comedy troupe Monty Monty Python's Flying Circus, if you remember that, those of you who are old enough, immortalized this historical period with their phrase, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but it was real." If only that period was actually funny. From the 4th century on, the institution of the church became more and more centralized with the reality of authoritarian priests and bishops who wielded real power over everyday believers. Christian societies in Europe and elsewhere were organized like the old Roman society increasingly. God and church at the top, then women and children, then slaves and animals, and on downward. The doctrinal teachings, too, were top-down and authoritarian. They were enforced. God was distant and unapproachable, out there somewhere. This part is where fear and religious harm really came into play, in my view. Unlike our UU method for constructing and doing theology, the traditional method was to kind of spoon-feed the beliefs into the lowly lay people. It was assumed that they weren't smart enough to make sense and put something together for themselves that made sense to them. And so is it any wonder that as the church became more authoritarian in its practices, it caused fear? And ultimately, people were harmed. How you construct theology can unfortunately, I think, determine how much pain and fear you impose on unsuspecting people who simply want to find believable answers for all of their questions about life. Now, the excerpt of Pastor Gary Pence's church experience that Louise mentioned or read from before, of how he came of age in the authoritarian Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, is a more contemporary example of the kind of real fear that churches have elicited and the harm that subsequently resulted in his own life. The fear and harm were directly related to the hierarchical way that the Missouri Synod Lutherans both construct their theology and the realities of how it plays out in the real lives of real people in awful and sometimes heart-wrenching ways. After our interlude, I want to try to sketch out in a broad way my proposed spiritual path as kind of a model, because like a lot of people, maybe like many of you, I really don't want to throw Jesus out with the bathwater, so to speak, and seeking to follow Jesus as my spiritual path really shouldn't have to include a whole bunch of fear and religious harm at the end of the day. First of all, I'd like to say that I assume that the growing abandonment of the institutions of the church in our times is at least partly a result of this fear and harm that I spoke about a few minutes ago. In the 90s, when I was a pastor, most of the preoccupation that we all had who were clergy was, why is the church dying and losing members hand over fist, and why is there no, or what should be the way that we revitalize the churches? And I assume that the way theology is articulated is abstract and distant for the most part from an average person's experience. Is it crazy to think that he or she might well think this stuff has little to do with me or my experience in life? The other important thing to say is that theology is easier to weaponize and abuse people if, in fact, it is abstract and distant from the everyday experience of people like you and me. if the weaponizer sits atop a big hierarchy that is distant from his or her audience, I'm thinking of the Pope as a good example, well, that person can't really see the results of their weaponizer religiosity, can they? Let me cite an example from my own family of how this works out sometimes. My Irish Catholic mother once told me when I was visiting home from college one weekend, with much more force than I was expecting from Mom, that she believed that a bunch of old, never married men should never have the right to tell her what to do with her body, how many babies to have, and when to have them. My mom is not a real radical person, but on this, she was pretty firm. And I count that discussion as my first profound education about women's experience and the important reality that a person's experience profoundly shapes and ought to shape their theological or spiritual beliefs. I was 20 years old at the time, and as an aside, I would also assert that this historical process that I've talked about that has caused harm and instilled fear in the psyche of many people has been fertile ground for the growth and popularity of post-Enlightenment atheism in the last few hundred years. But back to Jesus. For modern scholarship and its results, I think we can come to a consensus regarding Jesus' spirituality. There's been a lot of good work on this topic. First, Jesus never really intended for people to bow down and worship him. There's no evidence in the Gospels that that's the case. His desire was to show a spiritual pathway that could lead people to a place of compassion, right relations, and hope. No one excluded. Second, as the late Bible scholar Marcus Borg asserted in his work, Jesus was a rabbi seeking to be attuned to and informed by how he perceived the Spirit of God. He was a spirit person, was his language. Another way to say that is to recognize Jesus as a mystic. By that, I mean that Jesus encountered that which is divine as being not irrational, not rational, maybe non-rational, a different kind of experience, by awe, by wonder, by an experience through which a person can rationally say how she or he encounters this force of the Spirit or this phenomena. Only that this person encounters it in a way that transcends how this world often thinks about these experiences. And then third, all people, Jesus of Nazareth asserted, have equal access to this compassionate, life-changing force, which we can name, as I've said, and Marcus Borg said, Spirit. A force in our natural world which can't ever be seen with our senses, nevertheless one that can be understood to be powerfully and wonderfully able to change people and societies for the better. A person can, I believe Jesus asserted, turn from alienation or disharmony to wholeness and fulfillment. Christianity, in this new form of spirituality, can learn to play nice with other systems of religion and philosophical belief, which we Christians have not always played nice. The peace and harmony in the coming years absolutely requires, I believe, this plurality of truth, which is actually what we Unitarian Universalists have always been saying, right? And in our world today, we see the results all around us of the weaponization of religion and spirituality. In closing, I want to assert that Unitarian Universalism could, realistically, be a vessel for the kind of spiritual revitalization that I'm hoping can come about in our world. Amen.